everybody, welcome to WTF Hammer Underworlds. So since I just finished going through all the reviews for seasons 1, 2, and 3, I figured I'd put together a tier list, show all of my compiled conclusions. I figure from now on I'm going to do this at the end of every season's reviews, just because it's cool and it prompts discussion, and it's also a good resource for new players to get a sense as to which warbands, generally speaking, are useful to play, once again, in a general sense. So this tier list is not in any way based on the current meta, whatever meta that may be. This is just my general overview of warbands as they are able to perform across all metas. So let's just get right into it. So 5 tiers of ranks: D, obviously the worst, S, the best. We're going to be starting with the weakest of the warbands, first of which being the Steel Hearts Champions, who obviously do have some positives, but overall I have decided to rate as the weakest warband, basically for the following reasons: that their objective cards mostly promote engaging enemies and holding objectives, but they lack the movement, they lack the push options to reach enemies or reliably hold objectives. And also, since there's only 3 units in this warband, they struggle typically with that flex style. Also, their power cards illustrate that their best combat tactic is to stick together to cluster guard, but they lack objective cards to encourage this playstyle. Their strength is intended to lie in their defense because of all their guard power cards. The fact that they have 2 block die when inspired, they have 4 wounds each. But unfortunately, their defense is weak until they are attacked, which is the only way that they actually get inspired, which is just counterintuitive. So they're basically compromised by the time they actually inspire. And finally, they have a number of special combat abilities like cleave, knockback, but this is locked behind an inspire mechanic and is not encouraged by objective cards anyway. So the next warband that I've rated above Steel Hearts Champions are the Eyes of the Nine. So second to last in my opinion for the following reasons: they actually have one of the best spellcasters in the game who's able to summon the Blue Horror, which is definitely a cool mechanic. However, they do heavily rely on their leader for success, who is really not that difficult for the enemy to take out of action, and who isn't Molog or Hrothgorn level exceptional. Furthermore, this warband has a very difficult to pull off inspire mechanic, in which they have to land a ranged attack, which is no guarantee, and the leader only has a 1 dodge defense until this point. And even after these guys inspire, they really don't get a big boost. I mean, Vortimus, the leader, does, but everybody else in this warband's improvements are very minor. They have a good array of spells, I'd say. They have a good array of upgrades for their leader, but half the warband is complete garbage. Narvia, Turosh, complete trash, very much not redeemable. And finally, their only objective cards that are really worth their value are those based on spells, but they're hard to pull off. I mean, you have to cast many successful spells in a round, and also, once again, puts more reliance on the leader, who, if he's taken out of action, almost guarantees that this warband loses. All right, third from last, final D-tier warband are the Chosen Axes. So on the weaker end for a few reasons. There are some positives though, so this is the overall overview, that they do actually have a really good set of ploys which promote a diverse playstyle. However, their fighters are unimpressive until they inspire, and they probably have the most difficult to achieve inspire mechanic in the game, which is to hold an objective token in an end phase. But they actually do become very impressive after inspiring. They get huge boosts, which is nice. Their best objective cards support an aggressive play style, but their inspire mechanic necessitates holding objectives in an end phase, so there's a bit of a counterintuitive aspect to this warband. You want them to inspire so they can be good at attacking because their objective cards promote that, but then you have to hold objectives to pull it off, and their objective cards that relate to holding objectives are not great. And finally, and this is really the big downside of this warband, is that their movement is low. It's 2 across the board when uninspired, meaning they have to invest many actions and into many power cards just to be able to successfully hold objectives in an end phase in order to inspire. And they also obviously struggle to reach evasive opponents with their low movement. They have fewer tools to be successful than aggressive warbands in aggressive play, and they have fewer tools to be successful as other warbands are in objective holding play, meaning that they're just not really great at anything, unfortunately. And that does it for my D-tier ranked warbands. Moving on to fourth from last place in the C-tier, the Godsworn Hunt, who, after overlooking all of this warband's cards, I've concluded the following things about them. They have an expensive inspire mechanic in which you have to equip an upgrade for a unit to inspire. But, typically in Warhammer Underworlds games, players will tend to focus several upgrades on a few units to make a few units more exceptional, because that's just a solid strategy in general, which means many units don't really get inspired because they're not worth investing into the upgrades. And even though the inspire mechanic of this warband is expensive, they don't even get really big boosts when they inspire anyway. They also have low wounds and mediocre defense. Their highest unit only has 3 wounds, meaning that they're easy to take out of action, but they do compensate a bit by having many units and some defensive ploys. They also have a good combination of ranged attacks and high movement, which means that they can easily reach enemies and make attacks, and they're also rewarded particularly for taking out enemy leaders, which is just a cool option that these guys have. And I guess just as an overall view, these guys really are jack of all trades. They can hold objectives, they can kill, they can do positional play like supporting, but they're also very much a master of none. They have no push cards, they're mediocre killers, they're just hard to win games with. Moving on, we have the Iron Skulls boys, who are definitely cool and are definitely burly and have some positives. All these guys have positives, but I decided to rank these guys 5th from last. This is my overview. They can gain glory through support, which is nice because it helps counterbalance their unexceptional attack accuracy, because their attack accuracy just really is not great. And they have a lot of wounds. They also have a very likely to occur inspire mechanic, in which if they take a wound, they inspire. So it's basically guaranteed unless they get one-shotted, which is unlikely with 4 or 5 wounds, which is basically what these guys have across the board. Although their objective cards that actually promote the fact that they're tough are not exceptional. They're pretty bad. And they don't have any objective cards that support the fact that they inspire easily, unfortunately. So and just keep in mind, I am looking specifically at the faction-specific cards here, not universal cards. Third point, most objectives of this warband promote engaging the enemy and killing them. However, they have low movement, 3 across the board, and they have unreliable out-of-turn attack power cards. Therefore, this is actually pretty difficult to achieve. And they do also have cards to support an aggressive play style, but they lack versatility. They have no inherent ability to score passive glory, except in the 3rd end phase, but it's not reliable. So decided to rank these guys as a C, and they typically just don't perform well in any meta. None of these guys that I've mentioned so far do. All right, and the last C-ranked unit, well, the first C-ranked unit, I guess, because he's the best, because of the best of this tier, in my opinion, are the Farstriders, who have effective melee and attack options. They're a constant physical threat to enemy fighters, which is good. They also have a nice assortment of power cards, which provide a good range of offensive and defensive buffs. However, their defense is weak until they inspire, only having 1 shield defense. And they also have one of the most difficult inspire mechanics in the game, comparable to Chosen Axes, in which they have to be in an enemy's territory in an end phase, which is super dangerous. And with their low defense until they actually inspire, makes them very vulnerable. And finally, their objective cards just are not exceptional. Most of the Season 1 Warbands objective cards are not exceptional, meaning that these guys rely on universal card options to obtain glory, and the fact that they only have 3 units tend to make them limited in terms of the options that they have with universal cards. So that does it for the C tier. Going on to the B tier, we have the Iron Souls Condemners, who I ranked higher, mostly because they have nice cards, typically. One of the first of the Season 3 Warbands, they really started working on making these guys have better objective cards. So a decent array of objective cards promotes advancing and attacking. They also have a strong array of power cards, which complement their durability and generally align with the goals of their objective cards. So cards are cohesive. However, they have a very unreliable inspire mechanic, in which you have to basically roll a crit on either an attack or defense roll, and their defense is only 1 shield until they inspire, meaning that has no guarantee of improving. But they do have a good array of healing cards, which I guess helps to counterbalance the low defense when they're uninspired. And once again, big issue that a lot of warbands have here is low movement. They have 3 movement across the board. One of them goes to 4 movement when inspired. And they do have a few power cards to counterbalance this, but they still just generally struggle in covering ground, which is challenging considering what their objective cards are. So they are 7th place from the last. Moving on to 8th place from the last, we have Maegor Sveens, who I just felt were superior than Iron Souls Condemners overall. General overview is as follows. They have many objective cards that promote taking enemy fighters out of action, and they have solid damage dealing units, mainly when inspired. They also have many high-tier ploy and upgrade cards that encourage and reward killing, especially by clustering, which supports their aggressive playstyle. So there's some cohesiveness there. They do have a somewhat difficult inspiring mechanic, though, where they have to land an attack, which is no guarantee. It can result in units failing to reach their damage and movement potential. But they do actually have an Inspire power card, which is rare and which is nice. And I guess final point here is that they follow a predictable charging play style. They lack versatility. It's very rare that you're going to play against a Maegor Sveens Warband who isn't just trying to chop your head off. So not so difficult to come up with a counter strategy to beat them. All right, and next above Maegor Sveens are Garruk's Reavers, who have solid movement, good attack accuracy, and good damage options. So they're basically good at engaging enemies and then attacking them. They do, however, have low survivability, low defense, not really high wounds across the board. I'd say, though, that this is a bit balanced out through objective cards that reward having units being taken out of action. So even if your guys die, you could get glory for it. And their Inspire mechanic also requires that 3 units generically be taken out of action. So if your guys die, the other guys who are remaining can Inspire. So that is a nice counterbalance to the low survivability. They do have no special mechanics for holding objective tokens. They just lack versatility. I have seen them be played as a very controlled deck in the past, and with their good movement, they can hold objectives, but they just don't really compete against those warbands that have special move options. And they have a lack of faction-specific control cards. So I've seen a lot of universal cards be applied to help this warband be control-centered. So, I mean, if we're looking just at their faction-specific cards, they typically follow a move and attack strategy, typically don't score passive glory. Obviously, universal cards can change this, but inherently, Garruk's Reavers just are not great at anything aside from charging and dying trying. All right, next in line, we have Ilthari's Guardians, who I put above Garruk's Reavers, who I guess I have the following conclusions about. They have low wounds. I mean, not incredibly low, but low compared to other 4-unit warbands typically. They also inspire based on healing, which does promote recovering some of those wounds. So I guess that's a bit of a counterbalance, although this does require investment in terms of power cards. They also are somewhat rewarded for dying, because of their objective cards and some power cards that profit from having some of your units be taken out of action. And these guys are just difficult to inspire. You need to heal them to inspire them, and the objective cards and power cards that pertain to healing that this warband inherently has are just not very good. I would say, though, that their cards promote a versatile gameplay style. Unfortunately, that also means that they do not excel in any particular area. But interestingly, they do have many mechanics to impair enemy actions. So in a sense, you don't necessarily have to be super successful with Ilthari's Guardians. You can just kind of screw over an enemy's plans to reduce their glory cap and then hopefully pull ahead based on that. So that does it for these guys. Next up, I am putting the Wormspat, which I know might be controversial because they have done very well recently in the latest Beastgrave meta, even winning an online tournament. But, well, I'm going to go through my conclusions here, and that should show why this warband is not generally exceptional across all meta. I'd say, though, first of all, they're very tough. They have an awesome special ability in which if you roll a shield, you basically get damage reduction, which is super nice. Makes it unpredictable, makes it difficult to take these guys out of action. And their objective cards strongly encourage holding objectives, which is pretty ass for a 3-unit warband like these guys who are also slow. They're just not really strongly suited to hold objectives in the sense that their objective cards are promoting. Their inspired condition is also difficult. It requires that they ping 3 different enemies, and they don't have ping cards. The reason they did well in the latest meta was because there were many, or still are many, ping universal cards, but once those get out of rotation, I don't imagine that this warband will be nearly as competitive. This pinging playstyle also means that it's tempting to just hit units without taking them out of action, which isn't ideal because then you don't get the glory points for taking them out of action, and then your enemy can still use them for their own purposes. And I just finally say that these guys are technically versatile. There's a spellcaster, they can hold objectives, they're aggressive, so seemingly they're versatile. But practically they can only generally do well in each area. But, they just struggle because of their movement, their unit number, their card options. Above Wormspat, I put Spikeclaw's Swarm. So we're almost at the top of the B tier. So Spikeclaw's Swarm have a great set of power cards. It enables their effective movement, their control, and their attack options. They also have a ploy-centered Inspire mechanic, which is pretty cool. Units can definitely be inspired easily, but it does force the player of these guys to cater their ploys to this mechanic, choosing specifically ploys that have that choose keyword. And I'd say also that this warband excels at a flex style, so an aggro and objective holding style. Unfortunately, their faction-specific objective cards favor risky aggression and survival, which is just stupid. These guys have terrible, terrible objective cards. It's a mismatch. These guys rely heavily on universal cards, so they're very streaky, depending on the meta. And they're also pretty vulnerable. This warband depends on Scritch's summoning ability. If Scritch gets taken out of action, it becomes very difficult to win with this warband. But fortunately, Scritch is the greatest. And the top of the B tier, I have Sepulchre Guard, who I had ranked behind Spikeclaw Swarm until the recent soft buff with the whole raise counters and stuff, which, just gives them a few more options. Anyway, basically, these guys have a good combination of movement, special attack options, and power cards. Obviously, their movement is bad, but they do have that special Warden movement mechanic, which allows 2 units to move, helping them cover objective tokens mostly. These guys are also versatile, even more so with the raise counter mechanic. They do have a difficult Inspire mechanic. I mean, it's not that difficult. It's just unlikely that all of your units will get inspired, seeing as they have to spend actions to raise units, which is very unproductive if you just keep doing it over and over again. And even more so than Spikeclaw Swarm, I'd say these guys have a very heavy reliance on their leader, who has poor defense, 1 dodge defense, 4 wounds though, which is nice. But this warband can really be crippled easily. A well-timed teleport attack on the leader, and these guys are done if it takes place early enough. And similar to Spikeclaw Swarm as well, these guys have just crappy objective cards. They're completely reliant on the current meta with regards to scoring glory points because their objective cards are terrible. And now we're going to move into the more reliable A tier. So in my balancing videos, I had always tried to center my recommendations around having warbands, get closer to the A tier. Obviously, this is all subjective, but the weakest of the A tiers, in my opinion, is Grashrak's Despoilers, who have I'd say a very difficult inspired condition, having to take 2 enemy fighters out of action. It requires them to be effective at aggression, which they're not necessarily strong at, especially with their low accuracy before they're inspired. They also have many low wound units, kind of like Godsworn Hunt, and low defense. But like Garrick's Reavers, they can actually benefit from losing fighters and getting wounded because they have power cards and objective cards that do profit that. So it's not a complete loss. They're also super versatile. They're good. They have good flex options available to them. They have many hunters, although their spell game is weak. Bad faction-specific spells. No spell attack action. But I'd say that these guys do have quite strong cards. Kind of like Iron Soul's Condemners. They have many exceptional objective cards and many strong power cards that promote many effective playstyles. So I did rank these guys as an A. Just above them, I have Morgwaith's Blade Coven, who have a very high damage output potential, especially with that one character whose name I'm forgetting who has combo. But these guys are also best at killing when they're inspired, but they need to kill in order to inspire. So, I mean, they're still pretty good at killing when they're uninspired, so it's not as bad as for Grashraks in their attempts to take fighters out of action. Second point is that they have objective cards that promote both aggression and objective holding. And I'd say that their power cards are good at promoting aggression, but their objective holding game is not so strong. These guys also have relatively squishy units. They do although have some healing and defense boosting cards, which helps balance it out a bit. And I guess overall, these guys are very, very balanced in the options available to them. They could also be unpredictable. So when you're playing against these guys, it's not really clear exactly what kind of gameplay style you're coming up against. All right, next we got Molog's Mob, the big scary troll who has lots of wounds and he hits hard. He's difficult to kill and he's dangerous to engage. I mean, Molog is legitimately scary. This warband also has a good set of upgrades for Molog, who is very scary, which make him even tougher, make him stronger, make him more accurate. So it's all about Molog in this warband. And his ability to charge twice causes him to become a large physical threat, especially with his 2 range attack. He even has scything. But it is locked behind a compromising Inspire mechanic where he has to have taken 3 wounds. which means by the time he can charge, he's not super difficult to take out of action. And you definitely don't want him to die because then it's basically game over. And finally, this warband is heavily aggressive. Very unlikely you're going to play against a passive glory scoring type of Moloch mob deck. They lack versatility. They rely heavily on universal objective cards too because theirs are not very good. Next, we got Zarbag's Gits, who are cool. They have a scurry ability, which is super nice. Allows them to get great movement options. They can cover a lot of ground. They can hold objectives. They can surround enemies, score objective cards. Really nice ability, especially with the fact that they have 9 units. They have a lot of versatility in their actions and in their options. They can attack, good accuracy, so-so damage. They can use Snurk's ability, which is super awesome. He just spins around, does damage. He's really hard to hit. And they can just move easily. They can cast spells, so mega versatile. But they do have many low wound units, which means they give away a lot of glory points, especially against aggressive players. But they do have enough units to continue to apply game plan after units die. So even if guys die, you're not going to be super impeded. You can still cover objectives because you have so many guys left over. And finally, these guys don't have exceptional power cards, which is their real caveat. They rely on universal cards, so their effectiveness is similarly like other warbands affected by the meta more than many other warbands. So I put them as A because they are generally effective, but whether or not they're super effective or moderately effective really depends on the meta, more so than most other warbands. Next, we got the other set of goblins. We got Rippa's Snarlfangs, who are a 3-unit warband, and they're all solid. They're difficult to kill, they have high movement, and they're all competent. They also have very nice objective and gambit cards, which reward this warband for doing intuitive things and provide many movement and aggression options, although they do have kind of weak positional play, like holding objectives, that kind of stuff. They also do unexceptional damage, at least in their individual attacks, but this can be counterbalanced by their Snarlfang Bite, which allows them to potentially do 4 damage when uninspired, which is amazing. And they also have a fun inspire mechanic, where 2 of your units inspire if Rippa is attacked, and Rippa inspires when he gets objective tokens, so it kind of pressures your opponents to navigate their attacks away from Rippa, allowing Rippa to go to town. He's obviously the best unit in this warband. So really cool warband. Sort of perfectly balanced, in my opinion, as is Skate's Wild Hunt, who I put right above Rippa's, but not by a lot, who have very high movement and they're encouraged to charge, meaning that they can basically hit enemies wherever they are, especially since they have some range attacks. Their damage, although, is not exceptional, but since they have 5 units, all of which have high movement, they can attack frequently and then just wear down enemies until they're taken out of action. They have an easy inspire mechanic in which if you have a charge token in an end phase, they inspire. Unfortunately, they can't inspire in the first round, which could leave them vulnerable after a charge. If they charge in, they're just kind of sitting ducks until the end of the round when they actually inspire. And generally solid cards, well-rounded in aggression and objective holding play, solid flex warband. Above them, I've put Morgoth's Crushes, who are super scary and super burly orcs. Definitely a step above Iron Skull's boys. They're tough, 5 wounds, power cards to heal and prevent damage. They do have pretty subpar objective cards, though, meaning that they rely on universal cards and on killing in order to rake in glory points. And they have, I'd say a challenging inspire mechanic in which a unit needs to have 2 Wa counters in order to inspire, which requires making 2 attacks or taking advantage of power cards. But, it definitely is tricky because you also might want to use some of those Wa counters for the special abilities, especially for the leader when they're uninspired. So since they get these Wa counters from attacking, it makes them a little bit predictable, but they do have power cards, like I mentioned, to help them gain Wa counters as well. And finally, these guys are just killers. They have high base damage output. They have ways to increase that damage. They have amazing ploys. They have push mechanics to help them reach enemies. They are definitely scary. And just above them, I'm putting Stormsire's Cursebreakers, still in the A tier, who are just good spellcasters. There's 3 of them, and they're all spellcasters. They have full access to all gambits and objective cards that score based on spells. Even have spell attack action and spell abilities on each fighter card. They have strong attacks and defense, hard to kill. They're dangerous if they approach, although they do still struggle in movement with 3 across the board. Their Inspire mechanic aligns with their Strength, which is basically to cast a spell. And they have special spell actions, as I mentioned, meaning that they can score passive and active Glory and Inspire without much difficulty. And they have a versatile array of faction-specific cards, meaning that they can play many styles effectively, but they are weak in positional play, mostly because there's only 3 of them. And almost at the end of the A tier, second place in the A tier, we have Hrothgorn's Man-Trappers, who, the leader, Hrothgorn, he's a badass. He's Mollog level, solid ranged and melee, good defense, good movement. He's a hunter. He has great upgrades. He can be difficult to inspire, though. So can this whole Warband, in which he has to take an enemy fighter, or rather, an enemy fighter has to be taken out of action while adjacent to Hrothgorn, which is tricky at times. And this Warband is actually a pretty subpar until they do inspire. They have some very useful faction-specific cards. They have 2 restricted cards, which force this Warband to make hard choices, though. And finally, Hrothgorn's minions are generally competent, whereas Mollogs are not competent. These guys can hold objectives. They can use a trap, one of them can, Bushwhacka, or they can make decent attacks like Thrafnir. Definitely not useless minions. And the top of the A, verge of S, I have Thundrix Profiteers. Super strong Warband. They get a very large boost when inspired. These guys are a bunch of gunners, and they inspire when Thundrix promotes individual units after an objective card is scored, which requires no additional effort. Basically, you play the game and you're trying to score objective cards anyway, and whenever you pull it off, these guys inspire and they get huge benefits, Chosen Axes level, even a little bit better than Chosen Axes buffs. But like Chosen Axes, they have low movement, 2 across the board until inspired, which makes it difficult for them to engage evasive or passive enemies. But they do have a high movement unit, Drax Skewer, and they have multiple ranged attacks, which definitely helps them cross some of that distance. They're also very strong against aggressive opponents. This is really their bread and butter, where aggressive opponents charge into their territory and then they just go to town, taking shot after shot after shot. They can consistently make 4 attacks per round with high accuracy and have special combat abilities to score objective cards, which then makes them inspire, and it just gets really bad at that point. And these guys are also tough. They're difficult to take out of action. They have many units. They're one of the toughest warbands for sure. I'd say either second after Morgox or third after Wormspat. And that does it for the A. So now we're going to go on to the broken warbands, the warbands that I expect to be competitive for years to come because they're so badass. First of which, or I guess third place from the top, is Lady Harrow's Mournflight, who, they're just good. They have a really strong array of objective cards. They get lots of passive and aggressive glory. They do have some restrictions, but not a lot. Their objective cards are basically freebies, at least the ones that are auto-includes in decks. They have a strong array of power cards. They can viciously impair enemies while giving themselves large boosts to their versatile playstyle. And they have many special abilities. They hit hard, they hit accurately, they can cover a lot of ground, they're immune to terrain. But they do have a somewhat difficult Inspire mechanic in which they have to move through an enemy fighter. But it does fit into the framework of what their power cards promote and what their objective cards reward, so it's pretty cohesive in that sense. Second from the first are the Thorns of the Briar Queen, who, they're just good. They're really strong at holding objective tokens. They're probably the strongest with Varklav's push mechanic, although they do lack faction-specific cards to take full advantage of this. But, with all the universal cards that there are, it's really easy to make these guys pour in glory from holding objective tokens. They have kind of a dangerous Inspire mechanic, I guess, where, when it's these guys' turn, they inspire if they're already adjacent to an enemy fighter, which means they have to be next to it, and then the enemy gets a chance to make an attack or something, and then they inspire after. But they do have some power cards to help them overcome this, where they can surprise push their units, get next to an enemy, and then inspire on their turn. But these guys do have many restrictions, 3 restricted cards at this point, which is really why they're not first anymore. I had them first until the latest FAR list came out. These guys also have good movement. Aside from Varklav's push, they actually just have good movement. They can ignore obstacles, they do good damage, they have good accuracy, they have an amazing special ability, which is Varklav's. So they can really just overwhelm opponents with force while scoring passive glory. There's just a lot of them, and they're all scary. And finally, these guys have a large number of very powerful power cards, like sickly powerful power cards. They can perform feats that extend well beyond what other warbands are capable of, like Howling Vortex, where you can just push every fighter, which is just intense. And I'm glad you were patient. Finally, we're at first place in the tier list, which is the Grimwatch, who, like I mentioned, had as second place until the latest FAR. Now, I definitely think that Grimwatch is the strongest warband currently, at least in a general sense. Obviously, all of these positions can fluctuate in any given meta, but this is just my big picture overview. If ever you want to know which warbands are the best in any given meta, I think the best thing to do is just to look at how warbands are performing in tournaments, run an ELO statistical analysis on them or something, and then figure it out that way. But Grimwatch is very resilient. They have either 3 or 4 wound units, and anybody else who is lower than that can be ghoul called. They also have a free ghoul call, which is super nice at the beginning of each round. They can be difficult to inspire. Really depends against the type of warband that you're playing against, but they only inspire when there's fewer than 2 enemies in friendly territory. And they are a bit subpar until this point, although they do have many means to facilitate inspiring. They also have amazing movement cards, nice upgrades. They can destroy enemy upgrades. They're great at aggressive and positional play. They can debuff enemies. They're just brutal. And they have very nice objective cards. They have an amazing array of objective cards, which allow this warband to score passive and active glory, although with restrictions. And that does it. So this is my full tier list of seasons 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to keep rolling forward with my review videos going into Dire Chasm Season 4. And at the end of each of those videos, I'm going to be placing that warband in this tier list. And once Season 4 is done, I'm going to do another tier list video sort of like this, just positioning the newer warbands in where I believe that they fit in terms of how competitive they are across all metas compared to all warbands. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any thoughts or suggestions, please comment below, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. And that does it for me today, and I hope you all have a nice day.